Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled Progressives and Immigration. We'll be talking about the history of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but I want you to think about what conditions might have pushed immigrants to come to the United States. Famine, war, and revolution were some of the largest ones. For example, in the antebellum era, the Irish came in the 1850s to the United States, fleeing the Irish potato famine. Germans came at approximately the same time, fleeing the revolutions of 1848 and their aftermath. A little bit later, in the 1860s and 70s, Russia began issuing pogroms against Jews, and so those Jews fled from Russia. In addition, low-wage economies also pushed immigrants. What pulled immigrants is even more important than what pushed them, especially between 1860 and 1910. High-wage economies in countries like the United States and Argentina brought immigrants to the New World. Industrial demand for labor increased immigration as well, as mechanization allowed low-skilled workers to get work, and growing industry increased demand for labor overall. In addition, new ocean transport technology yielded faster ships and lower fares. Steel hulls replaced wood hulls. Screw propellers replaced the inefficient wheels. And there was a rapid expansion of the transport industry overall. Immigration in the Gilded Age and Progressive eras took certain kinds of forms. We'll notice, for example, that there was a change in the area and the country of origin of most immigrants. From the colonial era to the 1870s, most immigrants to the United States came from northwestern Europe. Also on the West Coast, there was Chinese coolie immigrant laborers from 1850 until 1875. Let's talk for a second about coolies. Coolies were indentured servants. They were part of a credit ticket system conducted by the so-called six companies based out of San Francisco. The six companies worked in harmony with the Pacific Steam and Mail Company that had a monopoly on transport to the Orient. This company enforced the requirement that a laborer had to have a certified debt repayment ticket before a return transport ticket was issued. Coolie immigration spiked after the Chinese began working as labor on the Central Pacific Railroad, and the arguments against Chinese assimilation and citizenship were the same as those that would be used against Eastern Europeans. And in fact, from 1880 until about 1914, we see that Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans dominated immigration. They were, for the most part, according to the Anglo-Saxons and Irish and Germans that dominated the United States in these years, that these people were swarthy, they were Catholics, and they were Jews. In addition, they were considered to be from authoritarian and collectivist areas and traditions, so they were considered to be non-democratic and not capable of becoming democratic. This bar graph shows the rise in overall immigration to the United States between 1891 and 1910. You can see that up to 1908 there was a steady increase and then a drop-off. This graph, as complicated as it is, shows the country of origin of immigrants from 1847 until 1919. Now look at this blue vertical box. This shows that there was a rise in Central and Eastern Europeans, that is the blue line, and Southern Europeans, that is the orange line. And there was a plunge in German immigration between 1881 and 1893. Now in the red box, we'll see a plunge in Central and Eastern European immigrants and a rise in Mexican immigrants, that's the maroon line near the bottom of the graph, and so-called other Americans, the darker green line, that increases dramatically in the period 1900 to 1914. there were immigration patterns. It appears that up to 30% of immigrants repatriated and more planned to but could not. For those who did come in, we see serial immigration as one of these patterns. A few early immigrants would arrive, mostly young men. They would amass some money and send back for their families, then their extended families, and then entire villages. We see another pattern in the concentration of immigrants in certain neighborhoods or towns and in certain trades. For example, Italian immigrants, particularly those from southern Italy, were the largest group who came to the United States. 50% of those repatriated, but before they left, they settled into distinct neighborhoods and towns and often worked in textile mills. Many worked within what was called the padrone system, in which a powerful local patron got them work and kept order in the neighborhoods and the communities. Jewish immigrants were similar. In New York, they often settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan and worked in the garment trades at shops that had been established by previous Jewish immigrants. Others settled in smaller towns and became merchants or peddlers. The first generation immigrants usually retained a distinctive original culture from back home. These residential and cultural clusters became known as ghettos. Settlement houses taught many how to function in the U.S. and in urban cultures, with the result that many children became Americanized. Of course, there was resistance to immigration. It took two forms that I'd like to address: nativism and legal restrictions. Let's look at nativism first. Anglo-Americans and later arrivals feared new immigrants. They took what's known as a Lamarckian view of acquired characteristics, such as immigrants from an authoritarian culture or tradition can never become democratized. They never will understand democracy, nor will their children, because their misunderstanding of democracy is passed on through their genes, we would come to know. There was also a Lamarckian view of the nation as a living organism that had to be related to itself, and components within it had to be related to each other, rather than as a social construct. Loyalty to the nation in this period began to replace loyalty to the race, and the ability to accept citizenship became the test of a good immigrant. The American Protective Association was the largest nativist group for the few years that it survived. It was founded in 1887 by Henry Bowers, and it was predominantly Irish Protestants and German Scandinavian Lutherans who were fiercely anti-Catholic. The American Protective Association was strongest in a line from Detroit to Omaha, and its central headquarters was in Clinton, Iowa. We'll return to that in a second. Its program, again, completely anti-Catholic, was to restrict Catholic immigration. English was to become the official language of the United States. There was to be no Catholic teacher in any public school, nor were any office holders to be allowed to be Catholic. Let's look at a map showing the distribution of immigrants in 1910. This circle indicates an area of intense immigrant concentration west of Chicago. This red arrow is Clinton, Iowa. And so Clinton, Iowa is a more natural place than it might seem to be the hotbed of the American Protective Association. Let's look now at this cartoon showing nativist attitudes toward immigrants. What stereotypes do you see in the immigrant at the gate? Take a minute and look at that. When you're done, look at Uncle Sam. What's he doing, and what kind of attitude does he demonstrate? Let's look now at legal restrictions on immigration. In 1875, Congress passed the Page Act, that tried to extinguish the Chinese coolie and prostitution systems that had emerged. But neither of those were quelled until the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was repealed in 1943. This is also known as the Immigration Act of 1882. This act kept Chinese immigrants out as much as possible, but Chinese immigration could not be permanently restricted due to treaties. However, these treaties allowed that it could be suspended year after year after year. So every few years, Congress passed a new law that suspended Chinese immigration. For example, there was another Chinese Exclusion Act in 1888 and yet another in 1902. In 1903, Congress passed the Anarchist Exclusion Act at the call of then-President Theodore Roosevelt. This was the first time that immigrants were tested for their political ideology since 1798. And in fact, it was an overreaction to the assassination of President McKinley by Leon Solgutz in 1901, who declared himself to be an anarchist. In 1907, we don't see a law, but we see a diplomatic solution to a problem that had arisen. This diplomatic solution is called the Gentleman's Agreement. And in the wake of the Japanese success in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905-1906, Japanese became proud and many in America feared arrogant. San Francisco, which was a center for Japanese living in America, the school board there segregated Japanese students in 1906. And when we find out how many Japanese students were segregated, you're going to wonder why this became an international incident. 90 students were segregated. There was no real threat from the Japanese students, and this seems to have gotten really blown out of proportion. Well, it got blown out of proportion because the Japanese, having pretty much been the victors of the Russo-Japanese War of 1905-06, and of course the victors of the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 95, then felt themselves to be an equal nation with the United States, and that its citizens and its second-generation citizens who lived in America should not be artificially restricted. Nevertheless, the segregation was based principally on race and racial hatred. Theodore Roosevelt negotiated this informal agreement with Japan, in which Japan, for its part, agreed to issue no more work permits or visas for immigrants, and the U.S. in turn agreed to not pass a Japanese exclusion law. Now, 6 years later, the state of California passed an alien land law that prohibited the purchase of land by, quote, aliens prohibited from becoming citizens, unquote. That is, all Asians under the Chinese Exclusion Act. There were immigration restrictions on Europeans as well. The Immigration Act, Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, levied a 50-cent tax on all immigrants, and that was expanded by the Anarchist Exclusion Act of 1903 to $2 per head. Literacy tests and similar restriction bills crept into Congress after 1900, but only passed in the Immigration Act of 1917 over President Wilson's veto. The Immigration Act of 1917 furthermore extended the number of excluded classes of people to include homosexuals, the mentally challenged, polygamists, and it reaffirmed the anarchist exclusion. This was not all of the classes, but it's the most significant classes. It immediately and effectively eliminated all East Asian immigration as well. That's the Immigration Act of 1917, a literacy test, eliminated all East Asian immigration, and expanded the excluded classes. In the aftermath of World War I, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. This introduced the idea of quotas of immigrants based on nationality, and it reduced immigration from 800,000 in 1920 to 300,000 in 1921-22. It was replaced by the highly restrictive National Origins Act of 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, that limited the number of immigrants to 2% of the number from their country that appeared in the 1890 census. Let me say that again. The number of immigrants who could come in any given year after 1924 was limited to 2% of the number of residents in the United States of that nationality or ethnicity that appeared in the 1890 census. Now, why the 1890 census? That was the last census before the big upswing in Southern and Eastern European immigrants. This law, Johnson-Reed, guided U.S. immigration policy until 1965. So in summary, immigration to the United States, as well as the rest of the Americas, expanded rapidly between 1870 and World War I. Immigration was pushed by problems in Europe, but pulled by opportunities in the New World, as well as technological innovations that made oceanic travel cheap and swift enough to put it within reach of many poor immigrants. The ethnicity of immigrants changed after the Civil War from Great Britain, Germany, Ireland. And let me make an aside here to say that forced immigration of Africans dropped to a trickle in the U.S. after the slave trade became illegal in 1808. It did not stop completely, but it became statistically irrelevant in any discussion of immigration. Now, outside of Africans, these Northwestern Europeans were replaced by new immigrants from China, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, and the Mediterranean, who were very, very different from these Northwestern Europeans. As with previous immigrants, these new immigrants followed patterns of serial immigration and concentration in neighborhoods and trades. Also, like their predecessors, their children became quickly Americanized. There was a backlash against immigration by those immigrants now considering themselves Americans. We see the rise of Nativism, which is an attitude and political position of fear and loathing that residents and citizens had against newcomers, often targeting specific characteristics or conditions like religion, or in the case of the Chinese, their importation as virtual slaves in the coolie system. And we see the rise of restrictive legislation, from the Page Act of 1875 that attacked coolieism and Chinese prostitution, to the Johnson-Reed or National Origins Act of 1924 that severely restricted all immigration and imposed a quota system. This then ends the lecture. And as always, thank you for your attention.